In order for neurons to do their job of receiving information, processing that information, interpreting it, figuring out the best response to that information, and coordinating a response to that information, they need to be connected together and work together in groups. So groups of neurons are going to be specialized towards doing different types of things, but we still need them to work together in order to actually interpret the world and respond to it appropriately. We have billions of neurons in our central nervous system, and so we need to have ways of integrating them together, getting them to work together in order to operate smoothly. Information in the brain is actually stored as how the neurons are connected together. When you learn a new skill, when you learn a new piece of information, when you study for this class, you are actually causing physical changes to the connections of neurons in your brain in order to store that memory. We call all of these connections in the brain the connectome. Just like all of the genes in your body is the genome, all of the connections in your brain is the connectome. And there's actually a project to map the human connectome. It's a pretty big task, though, because there's actually 100 billion neurons, but there's actually 100 trillion synapses, connections between those neurons. So it's a pretty big task. One way that neurons get organized is what we call a neuronal pool. So this is a functional group of neurons. The simplest form of neuronal pool is going to be a presynaptic neuron fiber and then its postsynaptic target neurons. So here we have a presynaptic neuron fiber. You can see that it branches out and it connects to these neurons. The ones that are closest to the fiber, you can see have a lot of connections, and then the ones on these periphery have fewer connections. So the ones that we call that are closest to the fiber that have the most connections, we say are in the discharge zone. The ones on the periphery are what we call the facilitated zone. Neurons in the discharge zone are likely to fire just based off of signaling from this single presynaptic fiber. Neurons in the facilitated zone can be affected. They can be made more likely to fire just from this single presynaptic fire, but they're unlikely to fire only from input from this presynaptic. But it can still regulate their behavior, just not completely control it. So these connections between neurons and how the information is processed is called neuronal processing. One type of neuronal processing is serial processing, in which the signal travels along one specific pathway to one specific destination. So this is an all or none system where one neuron stimulates the next neuron, which stimulates the next neuron. One example of this is what's called a spinal reflex. So in the spinal reflex, we have a receptor on a sensory neuron that's going to send that signal to an integration signal in the center, in this case, an interneuron in the spinal cord, which is then going to send that signal to a motor neuron, which is then going to stimulate an effector. For example, if you touch something hot, pain receptors send a signal along sensory neurons to the spinal cord, where it gets integrated and then sent to a motor neuron, where it produces the effect of you pulling it back. This is an uncontrolled, planned response that just happens. So one neuron stimulates the next neuron, stimulates the next neuron. However, to have higher level processing, more complex responses to behavior, we are going to need what's called parallel processing, where the input is going to travel along different pathways. So different parts of the circuit is going to handle different information or the same information differently and allow for more complex responses. For example, if you smell something, let's say you smell roses, you might not just think about a rose, you might also think about, oh, your grandmother used to grow roses, and when you were there, or you might remember someone's rose-scented perfume. There's a single sense smell that you both recognize as being one thing, but also you have all of these memories and connections to that thing. We have four types of parallel processing circuits, what are called diverging, converging, reverberating, and parallel after discharge. A diverging circuit is when we have one input but many outputs. This is also called an amplifying circuit because it increases the signal. For example, a single neuron in the brain can go on to activate hundreds of motor neurons in the spinal cord, which can then go on to have thousands of skeletal muscle fibers contract. So we're amplifying the number of cells that are affected by that signal. In contrast, we can have a converging circuit where we have many inputs, one output, a concentrating circuit. One example of this is that scientists discovered, and one of the first ways that this was discovered was with former President Bill Clinton, not his brain, but it was someone that most people in the country recognized his name, recognized his face, recognized his voice. While doing some experiments and measuring single neuron responses, scientists discovered that in people's brains, there was one specific neuron, not the same neuron in different people, but each person had a neuron that would respond to a picture of Bill Clinton. That same neuron would respond to just the name Bill Clinton or hearing his voice. So, and this is true for lots of things. You have an Eiffel Tower neuron, which will respond to hearing the word Eiffel Tower or seeing a picture of an Eiffel Tower. At the time, there was also the Jennifer Aniston neuron. These people are probably seem very old to you, but nowadays I guess there's a I'm very out of touch. Rihanna. There's a Rihanna neuron. Who's I don't know people. So, you have these neurons that are going to receive not just one type of signal and respond to it, but respond in the same way if you see a thing or smell that same thing or hear that same thing. All of those are going to lead to the same output. Then we have these reverberating circuits, where the signal is going to travel down a chain of neurons, which then feed back to the previous neurons. This is also called an oscillating circuit. This is going to help control rhythmic activity like breathing or walking, repetitive activity where you're just doing the same thing over and over again. But because we have these reverberations, it helps to keep our body aware of where we are in the process and to keep doing it over and over again. Then we have these parallel after discharge circuits where the signal diverges and then converges. But the signal travels along different pathways to converge, so the signal takes longer to travel along some pathways than other pathways, so it reaches this target cell at different times. So you get a multiple signals reaching the cell, so then we get this burst of impulses called an after discharge. And this can be involved in organizing complex, exacting mental processes like doing mathematical calculations. So different brain circuits are arranged in different ways in order to allow us to respond differently to different types of behaviors that we need to perform.